Good afternoon in beautiful and sunny Maastricht. My name is Tom van Veen. I'm the acting pro-rector of this university and I chair this session. Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Maximilian Bruder will defend the academic thesis Bridging Profitability and Sustainability, Essays on Private Sector Innovation for Sustainable Development in Low-Income Contexts. May I invite you, Maximilian, to present the summary of your study and the conclusion of your thesis in 15 minutes.
Thank you. Dear Prorector, dear members of the committee, dear supervisors, dear family, friends and colleagues, good afternoon and thank you very much for being here and joining the public defense of my PhD dissertation entitled Bridging Profitability and Sustainability, Essays on Private Sector Innovation for Sustainable Development in Low-Income Contexts. The motivation for my research is essentially twofold. On the one hand, sustainable development is stalling. Only 17% of the SDGs are currently on target, and progress is significantly off track. And on the other hand, institutional priorities are shifting. So development finance is tightening, with high-income countries cutting their official development aid budgets, and there's now a staggering gap of $4 trillion in SDG financing annually. And this, of course, raises the question of where additional resources and solutions can come from. And that makes my thesis quite timely, given that the role of the private sector for sustainable development is being discussed more and more, particularly for low-income contexts. And the idea is quite simple. By operating in underserved markets and introducing needed goods and services, private sector actors can contribute towards sustainable development while also profitably doing business in what I call mutual value creation throughout my thesis. And this win-win narrative is, of course, very appealing. Private sector actors earn a return on their investments, there is sustainability impact where it is most needed, and less public funding needs to be spent. However, in the past, this approach has seen quite mixed results, and the amount of private sector financing investment and activity in low-income context remains quite low. And that is mainly due to the fact that it's quite difficult to do business in these contexts. There are, by definition, affordability issues, lack of formal institutions, lack of resources, infrastructure, and oftentimes very special and unique sociocultural context. And that makes doing business ventures high risk, hard to sustain, oftentimes keeps private sector actors from entering these contexts in the first place. And so as a result, these ventures frequently fail and the feasibility of the approach remains rather unclear, which leads me to the research question that guides the dissertation, which is how can private sector innovation enable sustainable value creation in low-income contexts while maintaining financial viability? And the theoretical background of the dissertation is rooted in the theory of the firm, combining strategic management theory, economics of innovation, and finance. And in my conceptual framework that I mapped out here, the entry point and really the main center and unit of analysis of my thesis is the firm. And I use the resource-based view to try and understand how can sustainability actually act as a resource that enhances competitive advantage. How can firms reconfigure value creation and delivery through business model innovation? What types of stakeholders should be involved and how? How do innovations, once they actually get introduced into these low-income contexts, spread and diffuse, and what are the barriers that need to be overcome to do that? And finally, how can the financing of such businesses in low-income contexts be de-risked and finance flows better enabled? So I now briefly walked you through the introduction part. This is how my dissertation is structured. I will now continue with the 4 empirical chapters that make up my thesis. As I mentioned, private sector initiatives in low-income contexts are riddled with failures. So of course I wanted to try and understand what leads to these failures, and if we can distinguish any patterns of firms that actually do manage to diffuse their innovations in base of the income pyramid markets. And a lot of the literature focuses on either supply or demand side, so on the innovation process itself or the innovation's diffusion, but not so much their interplay. And so we developed this framework to map the chasms, the obstacles that innovations face and that need to be overcome in order to be successful. And that was on both supply and demand side. And we used then a set of cases that we analyzed and tried to understand which of these chasms are most likely to lead to the demise of an innovation, and what are some pertinent strategies for overcoming them. And we were also interested in how these dynamics differ for different types of organizations and the role of partnerships. And what we found was that more than half of the innovations that we analyzed failed, underlining the difficulty of doing business in these contexts. We also found that design really is key. So the design and the adoption chasms are highly interlinked and the most likely chasms to be encountered by any organization type. And if an innovation is not designed appropriately and suitably to the context, it will not be adopted by the intended user base. So it is really key to get the design right and context appropriate. Also, we found that organizations that form partnerships are much more likely to survive in these contexts, in these markets, because partnerships can leverage complementarity. So specifically for organizations that enter these contexts for the first time, partnering with embedded organizations can leverage these complementarities. And so one of the main kind of big picture takeaways is that an organization, a company really needs to look before it leaps. So to make a rigorous self-assessment of whether it actually has the required resources and capabilities and stakeholder relationships that are required for entering and profitably and sustainably doing business in these low-income contexts. I was then also interested in a specific subset of low-income contexts, and specifically humanitarian contexts, because they are a subset where private sector involvement is even more nascent and less understood. So to try and figure out if there's any scope at all for the private sector and what it could look like, we took a quite broad approach and analyzed existing literature to understand the state of the art of humanitarian innovation, and we covered more than 300 academic and practitioner publications to do so. And what we found here, again, to a degree mirrors the findings from the last chapter. So innovation design is often inappropriate and does not get adopted by the intended users, and that is partially due to the fact that affected communities are under-involved. There's a strong bias towards financing technology and pilots rather than scaling up existing solutions. And those two phenomena are partially due to the reason that it is the donors and the practitioners that are the innovation clients and targets, because they are typically the ones who pay. And that creates this sort of strange and disrupted and tilted market setup. And furthermore, we also found that financing is insufficient and short-term, and there's demand for more private sector action, but not really quite clear how that can be done. And building on these findings, I wanted to then follow up and also try and understand if and how affected populations can also be directly targeted by private sector actors in humanitarian contexts. And that brings me to my next study, which is on how lending to refugee entrepreneurs can become a viable business case by leveraging blended finance in the form of a financial guarantee. And what is a financial guarantee? You can think of it kind of as a type of insurance. So a guarantor, usually a donor or a development finance institution, provides a guarantee to a financial service provider for a specific loan portfolio and guarantees to repay if any of the borrowers default on their loans. And the borrowers in this case were the refugee entrepreneurs. So if any of them default, it's instead the donor that will end up paying. And that, of course, de-risks the lending of the financial service provider. And so I analyzed the first two cases of this, to the best of my knowledge, in humanitarian contexts, and it was in Uganda and Kenya, and tried to understand how this unfolded. And I found here that there are several necessary conditions that need to be in place, which are layered top of one another for such a guarantee to be effective. On the bottom, there needs to be an enabling environment, so the institutional, legal, and policy context needs to be conducive to this type of business with refugee entrepreneurs. There needs to be, on the second level, capacity building and adaptation of practices on both supply and demand sides. So again, this is very important. And ideally, there is a technical assistance provider in the middle that can bridge the gap between the bank and the refugee clients, so kind of make the market. And only then does a viable business case emerge on the top level, and there's actually demand for this type of credit product. And finally, I analyzed the relationship of sustainability and financial performance explicitly. So, because it is crucial. For a firm, it needs to be able to cover its operations through its core business activities, because otherwise it will either cease to exist, and then it can not create any financial or sustainable value for anybody anymore, or it will require free money either from public sources or philanthropy in order to continue its operations. So there is a big reason for making clear whether or not there is a business case behind these sustainable activities. And so using a novel data set, I constructed bottom-up several sustainability dimensions and analyzed their relationship with 3 different financial performance indicators. And what I found here was 5 distinct sustainability dimensions, and I think these are quite actionable for companies, and they reflect different types of activities and corporate capabilities. And what I found here was that there is variability in which sustainability dimensions are associated with better financial outcomes, and the effects differ by financial metric. And so overall, this chapter challenges the idea of a single business case for sustainability or lack thereof. And the findings also show trade-offs among these sustainability dimensions. So for example, the environment dimension is negatively correlated with well-being, social capital, and ethics, and shows that, in my opinion, maybe companies cannot be all-rounders, but rather they have to decide, based on their capabilities and resources and business models, which type of sustainable value they want to create. And I think this helps explain why empirical findings in literature have been quite inconsistent, because sustainability is not one construct, it's not unidimensional, and it does not affect all financial outcomes equally. So, what does it all add up to? The dissertation shows how firm-level innovation at the niche level, the micro level, interacts with financial, institutional, and relational systems at the regime or meso level under the shifting global ODA and SDG trends. And across these 4 studies, innovation outcomes emerge when there's alignment across these levels and not from firm actions alone. And so I think the main takeaway from this thesis is that this notion of mutual value creation is possible, but it's highly conditional and rare. And I try to show some avenues as to how it can be made possible across these different levels of analysis and in different contexts. And the thesis rests on this multi-angle approach and develops an interlocking body of evidence that collectively advances the understanding of when and why profitability and sustainability can align. And I hope and think that I've made some contributions to different communities and audiences, and that includes academic literature, policymakers and donors, but also to practice. I've already gone through them, so I will not repeat them here, but of course, happy to discuss them. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Kemp, Professor of Innovation and Sustainable Development at the Maastricht Sustainability Institute of Maastricht University. And Professor Kemp was chair of the assessment committee of this thesis.
Dear candidate, dear Max, let me say that I have a lot of admiration for what you have done. You worked on an important topic, private sector initiatives for sustainable development in low-income country context, including refugee settlements. And instead of using one method, you used multiple methods, QCA and structural equation modeling, for understanding conditions at different levels for successful PSI. And you also did an evaluation of 2 financial guarantee programs for new business activities, which is being used to make recommendations on financial innovation, the findings of which I think are very important. Well, humanitarian context is something new to me, but I think it's a reality which has been understudied. So I think you've done some very interesting and important work. So I want to congratulate you with that. Well, what you did was to examine the role of contextual aspects that directly impinge on decision making regarding new business activities, and also the influence of wider system matters that indirectly affect success and failure. Again, that is very commendable. Well, the thesis contains interesting hypotheses on which it offers well-supported conclusions. Well, actually, you made my task of asking critical questions very difficult. So I struggled with that for some time, but I managed to find a few. And those I will now put to you. My first question is about the actionality of your insights, especially the actionality about the DEPMAD framework. Design, production, marketing, adoption, diffusion. Which is validated via retrospective studies. Now, my question to you is, what if prospective innovators would receive a DEPMAD, let's say DEPMAD, that I think is easier to pronounce, training by you? How would that greatly alter the fate of the innovation that's being created and pushed forward?
Mm-hmm. Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words, and I'm happy that you managed to find some critical questions for me. Yes, I think one of the... I tried very hard in the thesis to ensure that there is some actionable insight, so that it is not only relevant for the academic community and policymakers, but also for potential innovators. And how to utilize this DEPMAD framework as a prospective innovator. I think each of these individual chasms, as we called them, the design, the production, the marketing, and so on, of course, for a private sector actor, these are known. They know that they have to go through these steps. But what is interesting is that there is, nevertheless, this very high failure rate, right? So how do you kind of bring that together, that there is this foundational knowledge, but on the other hand, there is continuously the attempt to go into these types of markets and create this mutual value, but still innovators keep on failing and failing. And I think at the end of the day, it is highly context specific, and so it depends on the sector, it depends on what kind of context actors actually do enter. But I think especially when it comes to the two, I think, most crucial chasms, which is the design and the adoption one, which are highly interlinked. If the innovation is not designed well, it will not get adopted. And to design it well, it requires, I think, really intimate knowledge of how the market, the community to which these types of innovations are supposed to go to, how they live on a day-to-day basis. And there are so many examples of innovations that were being developed by highly capable people, designed to great technical standards. One of the examples of a type of innovation that we covered also in the DEPMAD study is, for example, clean cook stoves. Those keep coming up again and again. And with them, what happens is so there's a few that were designed and they burned very cleanly and they needed less, biomass as fuel. So a lot of the kind of SDGs were being ticked off. But then they didn't come up to a high enough temperature. So the people who were supposed to use them couldn't cook the foods that they like to eat. And that, if they had involved anybody living there, just asked them, what kind of food do you like to make? That could have been preempted. So I think it all sounds pretty common sense in retrospect, but there is still no clean cook stove in sub-Saharan Africa that has been kind of adopted en masse by the rural low-income population segment. So I think, going into these contexts and learning about the realities of the life of the people is crucial. But then on the other hand, it is also, I think, instrumental in partnering up with other actor types. So for these types of innovations to take off, oftentimes it is simply not possible to reach a low enough price point that people can actually afford. Mm-hmm. And so then there needs to be support through these, for example, blended finance structures, and there are different ones. One of them is the type of guarantee, but there's also, just plain subsidies or results-based financing or things like that can come from public sector actors, from the government, or from development finance institutions, or from international donors, and they can then help to cross-subsidize and lower the price point, and then make these types of innovations affordable. So I think those, for me, are two main takeaways: the partnering and the knowledge of the context.
Well, that's a clear answer. Also, the example speaks for itself very well. Well, the follow-up question I had was about those chasms. Mm-hmm. Which ones can be managed and which ones cannot be managed so well? What would be your answer to that?
So I think the adoption one is the one that most often comes up with the failed innovations, and so I think that's the one that is most difficult to manage, and it is most closely related to the design one. So I think these are really crucial, and also once you have the design of an innovation, the company is a bit locked in, right? So it's difficult to completely redesign the product, whereas maybe the production, marketing, it's a bit easier to fine-tune them later on in the stage. So I would say this is the...
Yeah, but actually what you said before sort of was referring to something else, which is also the need for collective action, that other actors, well, finance actors, governments also come in to support it. Well, is collective action, I think, probably is something that's very hard to achieve. Or what did you learn about that, about barriers to collective action?
I agree with your statement that it is hard to achieve, because at the end of the day, the incentives for the different types of actors that are involved in this, in whatever collective action is, need to be aligned, right? And I think the chapter on the humanitarian guarantees is a very positive example where there are different actor types where the interest does align. So we have, on the one hand, both of these guarantees that were studied in this paper were put forward by SIDA, the Swedish Development Cooperation Agency. And then we had, in the case of Kenya, the Danish Refugee Council, who was doing the technical assistance component. And a Kenyan bank, Kenya Commercial Bank, and in Uganda it was Crédit Agricole, Grameen Crédit Agricole, which is sort of the foundational arm of Crédit Agricole, and 3 microfinance institutions. And I think this is the main benefit of these kind of financial innovations, that they do serve to align the incentives to a degree. Of course, the last actor type was the refugee entrepreneurs who ended up getting their demand for credit products filled. But yeah, when it comes to the limitations, they are again on several levels all over, I think. So of course there's competition among the private sector actors who try to introduce any of these innovations, right? So if you think about collective action in that sense of private sector actors coming together and sort of collaborating for sustainability, that is something that is difficult to achieve. There's also competition among the donors, even among the donor community and the development finance institutions. There's pressure now from this landscape level to link aid and development cooperation specifically with private sector outcomes all over, in the USA, of course, also in the Netherlands now, I think in Germany, in Sweden, everywhere. And so now there is a little bit of competition among them for which, development cooperation agency gets to go into which context and get these projects that are somewhat feasible and that can be de-risked through a blended finance instrument like the guarantees. So we have competitions also there, and I think that makes it very, very difficult to come up with collective action. It's really, I think, project and sector specific on where collective action is achievable.
Okay. The opposition will be continued by Professor Halme, Professor of Sustainability Management at the Aalto University School of Business in Finland. And Professor Halme was member of the assessment committee of this thesis, and she is with us online.
Thank you. Let me also start by sharing my appreciation to you, to your work, dear candidate, dear Max. This work shows great comprehension of multiple theories, of multiple methods applied in a challenging context. And it also comes up with several new and plausible contributions. And overall, I think it shows that you are able to think in complex systems, which is a much needed skill in the contemporary world. My first question regards the fact that when you outline the different conditions for mutual value creation, so both for financial and sustainable value, these conditions involve such as contextual capabilities, knowledge of local needs, management of production constraints, all of which relate to the local context in one way or the other. And I think that overall this work shows that you are a context-sensitive, context-aware researcher. And to me, it comes a bit in contradiction that quite frequently I read about big institutions and institutional voids in the thesis. And I think that these concepts, in a way, put in formal institutions, which are often strong and say the most sort of dominant institutions often in the global South settings, especially in the low-income ones. And recently there has been quite a lot of criticism towards these kind of concepts, which are basically originating from the developed markets of the global north. And yet it's the informal institutions that tend to shape business and entrepreneurship in the low-income settings of the global south. And my question to you is that if instead of the weak institutions, institutional voids, you would think in terms of institutional interfaces, so think in terms of how the formal and informal institutions meet and are in interaction and thereby shape the local markets, how would the concept and the thinking in terms of institutional interfaces and thereby in a way acknowledging that informal institutions are not necessarily inferior, how would that perhaps change, if it would change, your findings and recommendations in any way?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you also for your positive feedback and for this very interesting question. I agree that I do mention institutional voids, and there is a bias to a degree in the thesis in how institutions are treated. It does not maybe come out quite so much in the thesis, but of course I do believe that informal institutions are important. Let me give you an example. So in the chapter on humanitarian guarantees, one of the key instruments for enabling the financial service providers to lend to refugee groups was by setting up these village saving and loan associations in the refugee settings, which are basically a trust-based instrument, right? People collectively pay in their daily or weekly incomes, and then one of them gets to take out the amount and use it, for example, as collateral for a loan that will then be received from the bank. And this only functions, I think, because of the informal institution of trust being there and reciprocity. And in that sense, it is crucial to enable, I think, a lot of these innovations, especially in this case. But when I speak of formal institutional voids in the thesis, I refer to mainly on the country level, weak rule of law, difficulty of enforcing contracts, political instability, and so on. And I believe that at the end of the day, these factors are still definitely the main barrier for any type of financing or investment from the outside to flow into these types of countries, right? Because no lender will lend to a bank in a sub-Saharan African country where the credit status of the country is junk status, right? It's just, and that may be a biased view, and there is also emerging literature on that, but I think that's just how it is. So these are significant obstacles for finance to flow, and therefore also for business ventures to be able to take off in the first place. And I think to mitigate that to a degree, there are now these instruments like blended finance, and there we then see the I think what you mean with the institutional interfaces. So you can sort of get around the risk of these formal institutional voids, but at the same time leverage the informal institutions that are contextually suitable for this innovation. So I think, of course, there needs to be an interplay of the two. And I also think that, of course, these financial innovations, they can be targeted and helpful, but at the end of the day, the big lever to de-risking is the classic development economic notion of policy reform, institutional reform, and so on. But this is a very slow process. And while that is taking place or not, these types of financial innovations, I think, are a good way to kind of get around and de-risk. So let me stop there for now. I think you are muted.
Can you unmute your mic?
Thank you. I think your answer makes a lot of sense. And I'd say that interweaving what you just now said in the future work might also make a lot of sense, because I think it would be useful to make those distinctions more clearly in our academic texts. Mm-hmm. So basically showing that there are certain institutions, the informal local ones that might work and might be useful to leverage on, but then it's the more the political macro level institutions that wouldn't work. So in a way, showing the richer picture of the local realities also in our academic reporting might convey a more accurate image of the localities. And I assume I have still time for a very short second question, and that concerns your methodologies. As said, it's laudable that you use several methodologies, both qualitative and quantitative ones for different data sets. And I would be curious to hear your elaboration of, like, now when you look at your work at hindsight, are there anything which you consider the most valuable data sets and methodologies in terms of generating the most worthwhile, the most novel contribution to knowledge from your work regarding the business sector innovation for sustainable development?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you also for this question. And yes, it is an eclectic mix of methodologies, but they were driven by the research questions, and also partially by the fact that COVID was bang on in the middle of my PhD. So originally there was the ambition to do some more field work as well, but that unfortunately didn't work out. So I think, I mean, to me, the added value is this mix of methodologies, and I don't particularly feel that one of them was or is most worthwhile in advancing. I think it takes both the methodologies that give more of a broad picture overview, like the literature review, because that is a field, the humanitarian innovation field is very nascent. So I felt it was necessary to take, a sort of bird's eye view to first understand what is going on, but then also I tried to mix these broader and higher level types of studies with more detailed insights. So of course, specifically the case studies are a deep dive into one specific type of financial innovation in two different contexts, and also the DAPMAT framework, for example, it goes on a smaller data set compared to the last chapter to get some more qualitative richness into the analysis. And for me, what will be instrumental now in follow-up work is to take a more, I think, sector-specific view, and even within these sectors to look at particular innovations and try and understand the dynamics then for each one there. Because while it is, I think, possible to abstract to a certain degree, I think at the end of the day, the devil is in the details for trying to create this mutual value. And so yeah, that's also my aim now in the work that I'm doing now in Stockholm, to go deeper into specific sectors and try and understand the specific innovation dynamics there.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Diaz Gonzalez, Assistant Professor at the School of Business and Economics at Maastricht University.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Maximilian, I want to begin by saying that I generally enjoy reading your dissertation. It is a very interesting body of work where I guess still is the case. 2 of your papers have been already published, 1 is under review, and the final one is in a publishable format. This is a very nice outcome of your PhD. It clearly shows your independence as a researcher. Across the 4 papers, you examine different but very related domains: BOP innovation, humanitarian innovation, blended finance, and sustainable business model innovation. I appreciate very much the approach of your dissertation. You discuss the potential of mutual value creation, but you never treat it as a given. You show very clearly that it depends on context, capabilities, system support, and financing structures. You also wanted to show where organizations fail, not only where they succeed, which is a very important point of reflection when doing research in sustainability or in the sustainability domain. I do have a couple of questions for you. The first question I have is related to Proposition 3. Maybe we can ask one of the...
And one of the...
Paranym.
Read it aloud, yes? Can you stand and read it loud?
Mutual value creation is possible, though conditional.
Thank you. In your chapters, you include firms such as, well, you include different type of organizations, but some of them are NGOs and humanitarian agency as your empirics. Clearly, these are hybrid organizations holding dual but competing objective. Looking across these actors, which part of your overall framework, the one that you present in chapter 6, do you see universal? And which parts are depending strongly on the organization mission or mandate for sustainable innovation?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you so once again for the kind words and your feedback and for this interesting question. And yes, I did want to make a point of bringing out different types of organizations and how they operate and succeed differently in these contexts. And I think the paper on the DebMed probably makes this most explicit. So we look at 3 different types of organizations there. We look at multinationals, at domestic firms, and at non-profit organizations. So this is the type of hybrid organization that you're referring to. And what we see was that these hybrid organizations have a significantly higher survival rate when trying to introduce innovations into these low-income contexts. And this shows, I think, the difficulty of a purely market-based approach. It's when the survival of a profit-based organization is only based basically on the appeal to the customer base. Whereas for these hybrid organizations, we see, or there is another income stream, right? Because they are receiving public funding from donor countries, from multilateral organizations, or through philanthropy. And so that, of course, makes the risk significantly less severe for these types of organizations to if the innovation that they introduce is not as in demand, they still have this other sort of fallback not revenue, but income stream. And yeah, that makes it less risky for these hybrid organizations. To get specifically to your questions, which parts of the framework are universal. So I think that we see now a trend through these blended finance approaches that makes the line between these hybrid organizations and for-profit organizations more and more blurry. Because there are now quite a lot of for-profit organizations that also receive additional income streams in the form of, for example, results-based finance, but they are for-profit actors at the end of the day. And so I think the framework has applicability also to these hybrid actors. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, they for now still have it somewhat easier to pursue this mutual value creation while focusing more on the sustainability impact than on the profitability. But yeah, the way things are going now in the political environment and with all of these sort of streams of funding being cut more and more, I think there is a pivot towards supporting more purely private sector actors through some of these blended finance instruments, for example. Yes, so let me leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you. I assume I have time for a second question?
Yes, you have.
Thank you. Now, thinking or looking at the future, Maximilian, if you were to design a long-term program, research program, where you are working currently in Sweden, following organizations over time, what are the key learnings of these dissertations you will want to study on these organizations longitudinally? What type of empirical strategy will you use? And what will you design? What will the main elements in designing this long-term program?
Thank you for the question. Could you repeat the first part, please? I didn't quite...
Thinking that you will have to design a long-term research program, or let's say write a project proposal for the future, taking the main key learnings from this dissertation, how will that look like?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for repeating. And that's an interesting question that I'm thinking about a lot, since I'm now have the privilege of basically continuing along this research avenue in the work that I'm currently doing. Yes, I do think it would be crucial to follow some of these organizations and projects over time, longitudinally, and to also try and understand a bit more explicitly the type of impact that is actually generated. So that is something that in the dissertation is sometimes a bit more assumed. But having an idea of what type of sustainable impact is actually generated, I think, would be crucial. And something that I've become very interested in recently is also the difference among the different SDGs, in which ones are more suitable for private sector action and which ones aren't, where there's a clear limitation. So for example, we've seen now the past few years in low-income countries, there's been a huge surge in renewable energy, which is of course very, very good for SDG 7. And one of the there are a few main reasons for this. One is of course the cost of technology for solar panels, for example, has dropped by 99% in the last 50 years or something like that. So there is a clearer business case, and there is a clear revenue model to this type of sustainability impact, right? You sell energy. But there are now new also priorities that I think can be seen in the international development landscape, like nature and biodiversity, which don't have these types of revenue models attached maybe quite so naturally. So I think going into and trying to identify the limitations of these types of SDGs that are more public goods, right? Like resilience, climate adaptation, and so on. And are there also pathways for private sector actors to enter these spaces? I think that could be interesting to identify the differences. And in terms of the empirical design, I think it would be very interesting to do a multitude of case studies, essentially, and maybe have them a bit more concentrated, perhaps in one sector and in one country or group of countries that are a bit more similar. And I've become quite the fan of the QCA methodology, so I think that could be something that can be used again to identify the drivers and obstructors. And yes, so these would be some of my ideas for future research.
Dr. Diaz-Gonzalez was member of the assessment committee of the thesis, and the opposition will be continued by another member of the assessment committee of the thesis, and that's Dr. Turkeli, assistant professor at UU Merit, which is part of Maastricht University.
Thank you, dear Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Max, congratulations for compiling up this very nice book. It's a very brave topic, courageous decision that you made, working on these kind of sensitive topics. And looking at your first proposition, thank you very much for that. It took me like 10, 15 years ago when I first delved into this book. So there's a saying, a creative destruction and capitalism. I want to ask you about that. What is creatively destructed in the private sector innovation in low-income context? Because if we approach it from a critical of capitalism point of view, we can easily see that these are just some implications of market expansion policies. It's nothing about innovation, it's nothing about low-income context, but a market should expand, and there are some constraints there. So I wanted to ask you about this. What is creatively destructed in these private sector innovations, and the extent of inclusion? So how these users included as customers, clients, or designers, co-owners of the final innovation. So I want to learn about the extent of the creative destruction here and the inclusion. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, highly esteemed opponents, also for your positive feedback and for this interesting question. So I think it's important to recall how innovation is defined throughout this thesis. So the way I conceptualize it, or the conceptualization that I use of an innovation, is not that it needs to be something that is new to the world, but something that is new to the context. So it doesn't have to be an invention, but just something that is contextually new. And then I think there is quite a bit of creative destruction going on in these low-income contexts. So going back again to the example of renewable energy, what happens a lot currently still in a lot of these contexts is that people, generate electricity with diesel generators and mini grids or other types of electricity generation are dependent on fossil fuels. But because of the enormous cost reduction of solar energy, I think these fossil fuel-based energy generation business models are now being disrupted, and something new is created instead, which is the PV, the photovoltaic energy. And I think that is crucial to keep in mind. And there are also examples where it is maybe not really the destruction of an incumbent industry so much, but just there was nothing before, right? So a lot of people maybe didn't have any light in their house or any use of electricity in the house before these kind of solar home systems or whatever they're using arrive. So it doesn't all need to be destroying something, but I think it is creating something. And to come to your second part, the users and the different roles as customers, as designers, as creators. I think it's different levels of or different variations of this approach. So I think at the most basic level, the private sector seeks to have these people as customers, right, in low-income context, because that's what the business model depends on. But then, as I also tried to point out in a few of the chapters, having the local population involved in the innovation process is oftentimes also beneficial for the company. So if the local population gets involved in designing, it is oftentimes more appropriate to the local context. It's a better fit, the innovation. Using local people as employees can often create trust. It builds capacity, and that can have, I think, spillover effects throughout the communities. So that can be very beneficial, and also the role of creators, I think, is becoming more and more crucial and instrumental. So I'm not trying to suggest at all that these innovations have to come from the West or from developed countries and then enter these contexts. I think it is crucial to enable local creators, and I think this is something that is also happening more and more, or at least is tried to being encouraged. And there are some incredibly successful examples of this. So everybody's darling in this inclusive innovation field is M-Pesa, right, the mobile money payment system. And I think the idea for mobile money has come up with by a software engineer from Uganda. And then M-Pesa was introduced by Safaricom, which is a Kenyan telecommunication company. And that has been a huge success, right? So there are some estimates that 2% of Kenyans have been lifted out of poverty through this innovation, simply because it reduces the transaction cost so much, and you can send money to your friends and family through your mobile phone, rather than having to go to the next city, to Western Union or something like that. So yes, so there are different roles for the local population, and again, it is sector specific, but they should be. I think there's room for all of these depending on the context. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, we have still 2 minutes for a second round. Start again with Professor Kemp. You have a question for the second round? Okay.
Yeah, well, then I have a few questions, or one question about the econometric analysis and the research experience of that. I think you did a lot of work for that, but how satisfying were the results? How to what extent did they also make sense? And maybe as a more critical question, why didn't you include moderating variables or mediating variables, which influence the strands of certain relations and interaction effects? Because I didn't see these included. So several questions.
Yes.
For the last minute.
highly esteemed opponent, thank you for this question. And as part of the structural equation modeling, the exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis, I was unfortunately restricted to a rather small sample. So I combined these two different data sets, B Corp, which scores companies on their sustainability. And I think at the time of when I started the data collection, there were around 4,000 certified B Corp companies in the data set. So that's quite a lot. But then because B Corps are mainly small and medium companies, and then trying to match that to financial data, which is more on public companies.
Now, I must say you may finish your sentence, unless you have done so.
Matching the B Corp data set with financial data, unfortunately, reduced the sample size quite a lot, and therefore moderation or mediation analysis, which I did have as a previous model specification, unfortunately, didn't have enough statistical power. But fortunately, companies keep getting certified, so I'm somewhat optimistic that that can be done in the future.
Sorry. Maximilian Bruder, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room. Maximilian Bruder, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Ramani is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
All right, please. Thank you. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times? To be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
Then, by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you Maximilian Franz Georg Bruder, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate, signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. We should let it fall.
Professor Ramani will now deliver the laudatio.
Okay, Max, congratulations. You have proved to everybody that you're intelligent, articulate, and capable of defending your ideas with logical argumentation. Now, for the others, I don't know if they know the other side of Max, so I'm just going to tell a few anecdotes, few stories. The story with Max begins in 2019, pre-COVID times, when UNU Merit was bustling with students and people, and the walls had eyes and ears. So it was brought to my notice that this man was being very friendly with a certain Indian girl, and being her compatriot, I felt it's my responsibility to ensure her well-being. So I activated my informal women's committee in UNU Merit to dish out the dirt on Max. So they came back to me. He's a nice guy. He's a good guy. So that's it. I was reassured. Then he came to me wanting to do a PhD on pro-poor innovations. Yet again I questioned. He's from a developed country. He doesn't look poor. Why is he interested in all this? But my husband had bigger concerns, Max. A German with an Indian? Germans, he said, are punctual. They are professional. They are structured. And Indians are, well, what I can say is both these concerns proved to be unfounded because his interest came from the right place, from scientific curiosity and empathy. And I think he has printed over all the socio-cultural hurdles with great patience, and we got along just fine. So by this time, I was also under the spell of his charm. And for me, charm is not speaking smoothly. It comes from sincerity and being trustworthy. COVID happened, so you see, he became one of my youth advisors whenever, in our projects we had to deal with a tough academic. Many academics are pretty challenging. And, or then you see our institution was going through upheavals and one was not always happy. Then he also participated actively in my NGO and gave feedback. So that was great. I saw how practical and grounded he was in converting ideas into recommendations. But in the meantime, I also saw him grow intellectually. He had sprouted wings even before this defense, getting contracts, writing papers, and getting a job. Now, after all this, there was one thing that I will never forget. Then I became sick. I had a major health challenge. And I remember the day when I was struggling in a friend's house, old student's house in Maastricht, and all my students were taking such good care of me with Sardar. Max took the leadership and the decision to drive me all the way from Maastricht to Paris, where I live. I will never forget this act of kindness. And that is the heart of what I want to say today. See, in every walk of life, there are many smart people. There are many articulate people. There are many intelligent people. But there are not enough people who are compassionate, who are sensitive, who are straightforward. Max, you're all that. So you will go far in life and do good, not only to yourself, but to everybody around you. So all the best.
Thank you.
Before we finish the session, I would like to give the floor to Professor Halme for her congratulations.
Dear Max, I'm really sorry I can't be there, because actually at this moment I feel very moved by the admiration of your written work, of your defense. And also I think that although I haven't met you more than twice, I fully believe what Shreyama was just saying, because somehow your, say, intelligence and empathetic attitude to life sort of shines through. And I also believe that you will do important things in the future. And it's kind of strange that old people say these things, but I think that in some strange way, you learn to see these capabilities from younger individuals. So it's a great pleasure to have been part of your journey, even in this very small way. And I'm happy that you are now living in a neighboring country to myself. So I look forward to, sometimes talking about the low-income emerging markets, sustainability, and so on, when I visit Stockholm and Stockholm School of Economics. And I will also do my best to promote you around those, say, academic circles, because I think that you would have a lot to give also there. So thank you for allowing me to be part of your journey, and have a very good future.
Thank you so much, Minna. Thank you.
Thank you, and please stay a while on screen for the photo. Dear Dr. Bruder, on behalf of Maastricht University and of the School of Business and Economics, I congratulate you with the degree that you have acquired. And herewith I close this session.